Hi guys, I'm Bede. It's that, the weird name there, first half of that. So first of all, just to carry on with the theme of the night, I want to apologise because at about sometime this afternoon when I came to review my slides, I found out my logic board was fried on my computer and everything completely died. So thanks to Kevin for lending me his laptop, and also thanks to the Apple Store for letting me camp out there for a couple of hours and rebuild all my slides on a Safari version of Keynote, which was fun. But anyway, so forgive me if they're all a bit all over the place. But I'm Bede. I used to be a freelance web developer, but since then I've worked on sort of a few different agency projects and startup projects and things like that. But for the last 12 months I've been working on something called Simpla, which is a startup I've been doing with my co-founder. The last 6 months of that we've been working out of the Bede accelerator down in Sydney. And basically today I want to talk to you a bit about what Simpla is, why we've built it, how we've used web components to solve some of those problems that we faced, and what I think the future on the web looks like with web components, particularly relating to content management. So this is what we've... I'm really glad the previous guy talked about WordPress because seriously it's awful. But this is what we found with, this takes up almost a quarter of the web. It's got a really bad user experience. It's not interoperable. From a developer standpoint, if you've got, if you like to work with a particular language or want to work with a particular framework, if you then want to work with another CMS, they've got an opinionated view of how that's got to happen, and you don't really have much say in the matter. And the last thing is the walled garden, which kind of ties into the previous thing. Basically, if you want to add a new feature into whatever CMS you're dealing with, you've either got to hack around with custom code or look for a plugin that's going to work specifically with that. It's pretty rare you're going to find a generic one that's going to work with everything. So our solution for that problem was Simpla. Simpla in a nutshell is a collection of custom HTML elements based on the web component spec. Each element essentially is broken down into viewing and editing modes where a user can edit the content in those custom elements. And essentially all they do is get data and put data over a RESTful API. Just out of curiosity, who here has heard of web components? Cool. Who uses web components in production? I want to talk to you guys, wow. So that's something that's really interesting because it is very, very new. There's not a lot of people doing it. We ourselves are using Polymer to help speed up the development process, help make our lives easier. So this is a bit about, this is actually what's going on here. So when I said HTML elements, this is literally what you're writing out. So for text, if you want editable text that's dynamic and editable in the browser, you write out Simpla text. And this is what it looks like for every user that comes and visits the page. Except if you then log in. And all the login process does on Simpla is adds in the editable attribute to an element. And that's the great thing about custom elements, is you're just dealing with HTML. And then this makes this rich text editable. You can highlight in a toolbar or come up and do all that nice things, etc., etc. But essentially it's broken into these two simple modes. It's an image itself, same deal, so it behaves just like a regular HTML image in viewing mode and everything like that, except for when you add editable attribute. And now it's dynamic. The user can click on it, they can scale it as they need, they can upload a new file, they can add a title tag, things like that. And in terms of behind the scenes, all that's actually going on here is when an element is attached to the DOM, it loads in data from a RESTful API using its ID, and then it puts data when a save occurs. It's really basic under the hood, but using web components, it means that it's really flexible. So because of this, we've ended up with these custom elements. So custom elements means that it's interoperable with any other framework on the front end. Also, because it's HTML based, we don't actually care about your backend, which is something that's really interesting. Basically, as long as it ends up as HTML, you'll end up with the same deal. And because it's, as I said before, because it's HTML elements, any library you use with it, it'll work fine. You can use React, Angular, Ember, whatever you want, as long as it ends up touching HTML and you're using our HTML elements, then it will work fine. And that's something that I'm really excited about with web components. Also Shadow DOM, I think someone's touched on it before. That's something that allows us to add in that editing UI really easily. Basically, with Shadow DOM, you're fully isolated from the user's styling, and you also aren't afraid when we're developing these elements, we're not afraid that any JavaScript that's focused on the internals of the elements or any styling that we put on those elements is going to affect the rest of the user's DOM. And also, there's a bit of an odd point. The really cool part is because we're operating with native HTML elements, we get all the things that come with a DOM, which means native DOM events. Web Components provides things like attached callbacks and detached callbacks, created callbacks, so we can hook into all of these and manipulate the data and what's going on with these elements dynamically as these events happen in the DOM. And all the user or the developer who's using our elements has to deal with is just, they're just like regular HTML elements. So this is cool. This has gotten us to a point where it's kind of like, cool, I've got these editable elements on the front end and I can like set data in them, and that's nice. But the really interesting thing is when you now take dynamic content and put it on the front end, you end up with being able to really easily manipulate and update that data without going back to a server. So something, for example, that we've played with is internally in these elements, each of them has a unique ID, which scopes their data back to the server side of things. Now, to be able to scope this data, you can declaratively build up using Simpla block. So Simpla block has a Simpla ID, and then your Simpla text, for example, has an SID. So you actually end up with these all end up concatenating together. And you can change these on the fly because we're just working with DOM and attribute changes. All you end up with doing is listening for these attribute changes and then calling a fetch on the data from the server. So for example, this is an actual example of if you wanted to localize your content based on the browser's locale, you can actually fetch this Simpla block element and just change its SID imperatively using JavaScript. So I didn't actually know this, but the Navigator object will actually have a language. You'll probably want to normalize this across browsers because, funnily enough, it's not standard across browsers. But then you set that to the SID, and suddenly all of this content that's loaded in the Simpla text will refresh dynamically based on just because those SIDs have changed in the DOM. Another example of this would be page templating. So if you wanted to, your URL, you could just pull out a section of your URL and assign it to the SID of a Simpla block, which essentially will update the internal IDs of any elements on your page that are wrapped inside that block, and it will update their content. So you can have a front-end page that you direct all of your URL requests to, say if you've got a repeating blog entry that follow the same templating structure. But this is literally all you've got to do in JavaScript to be able to update the content and reflect that content to the actual blog post. If you wanted to create a new one, you just go to the ID in your URL that you wanted to create, and you end up with a blank page, but you went to edit mode, and you're able to input all the data. And that's something that I think we're really excited about because it means that you can create these really interesting sort of dynamic structures purely on the front end without needing to have a particular backend framework. Or you can have whatever backend framework you want to represent this and do all your routing and extra things. So basically what we end up with is sort of a tool specifically for content management without the, I guess, system and craft around that. And I think that's what's gotten us really excited. So for the future of what we want to see, I mean, Simpla is just our attempt at doing this. What we want to do is we want to see people building components that attach to content, that reflect to content. And with web components, you can actually do this. I mean, if people do this with other libraries or frameworks that aren't spec compliant, that don't give you that isolation, then you're not going to end up with this great distributable library. But if people do components, all you're exposing is a HTML interface, and you can talk to an API in the backend, or you could have it so that it plugs into different APIs, so you can have different content backends. If you want to have a Firebase backend or whatever, you can plug that on top of it. If you want to change the UI, you can use CSS variables on top of your HTML elements, which I think which is something that Polymer, for example, allows you to do. And then you can just style all these custom elements. And that's what excites us, and that's why we chose with web components, is we want this future where people can just mix and match the dynamic content that they want and the HTML elements and the web components that they want, and then layer on imperative APIs on top of that, however they like that. So yeah, sorry, I was quite brief. I would like to have had demo, but as I said, everything blew up in flames. Any questions about any of that? Yeah.
So you said it's all based on the IDs, like the SIDs, is it?
Yeah.
Okay, so you have like some kind of like routing or configuration how that's like you said this main / or whatever foo. That means go get the content at main foo or whatever. Right?
So in that routing example, I was purely just that was up to you. So if you want to map the URL, the current route, to the SIDs.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm talking about. I'm saying like right there, you got the top one, you have the symbol block.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, how does that map out to an eventual UID? So currently, internally, what we've got is it will just concatenate them together with dots, and that's fired over the API. To where?
Yeah.
Oh, to an API. So I think that's what I said before. So we host a RESTful API. So this is pointing to this. So each element is baked in at the moment a RESTful API that they talk to, and that's where the content is getting set.
So you guys have your own like service?
Yeah. So we're hosting a service at the moment. What we want to do in the future, we don't currently have it, which really sucks, but we want to have in the future local install versions, which is like a single tenancy, so people can just do everything in their own little isolated atmosphere, but we don't have that at the moment.
Do you have any intention of making it like really open, so it just says like, you have a drop of chunky JavaScript when you hit a page that says, rather than going to the simple backend, maybe obviously it might be so many what you're trying to do or whatever, it just goes to do something based on this, if this has changed, go get this content, and then in the client you can do a request to anything in that case.
Yeah, so I mean, there's sort of two ways you go about that. I mean, so the way that you install this is you drop in a bit of JavaScript code, and all the front-end code is open source at the moment. And what we've done is go, as a configuration, you can change the endpoint. That doesn't quite answer your question though, right? That's just pointing the data to another API endpoint. The other thing is because of all the custom elements are all open, the way they will serialize their visual data into a JSON blob, and that's sent over to the API. So you could internally, instead of when a save occurs, rather than going, yeah, cool, that fires off, you could intercept or listen for that save event and go, okay, I'm taking all my elements, serializing their data and doing something else with them that I want to do.
So this is separate, but have you considered, or do you already back up, say if you have like 50 elements on the screen, they'll have their own source effectively. I'm assuming you don't do 50 GET requests?
We do 50 GET requests.
Have you considered doing one effectively?
No, so there is, I actually brought up a friend of mine was doing a talk on H2 multiplexing, and that's something else that we rely on heavily because the thing with, if you were to batch all of those requests, because what we're listening for is essentially when DOM events get added. So we could just assume that all the elements are on the page on that first load and go, okay, we're just going to wait until the body render has occurred, and then we're going to go through and batch everything into a request. But if someone's using an SPA...
every 10 milliseconds.
Yeah, so we could do that, but we have available H2 multiplexing and also Spidey as a fallback, which covers all the browsers we need to support, i.e. 10 plus, I think.
So what backend are you using if you've got, so you're using HTTP2, right? So you've got they will run through the same socket. So what backend do you use then?
So we're using Google App Engine, which when we were looking around is surprisingly one of the, I think I found, I can't remember, Bluemix's hosted their version of App Engine, but like the big players like AWS and Azure, they didn't offer H2 out of the box.
Like nothing has it pretty much.
Yeah, so one of the big reasons we went with Google App Engine was for that reason.
Yeah. You got, I mean, this is going to be like a stupid question, but it's quick.
Yeah.
Cool.
So something where no, it's really slow. It's terrible. No, so something that we are working on at the moment is element registration time. So that's the bottleneck now. Our network requests are fast enough now that we're happy with it because everything's pushed out to a CDN as well. So it's really quick in fetching the content. But the big thing is getting those elements registered on the page and making that request as quickly as possible. On Chrome, because it's native, it's really, really quick. On Safari and the other ones, it's still quick and it's still definitely usable working in production, but there is a slight lag, and that's what we're trying to improve. And it's just for us, there's a bunch of perf improvements, like for example, at the moment with our elements, they're pulling in all the editable features as well as the viewing features, whereas ideally you just pull in the viewing functionality and then lazy load in the editing functionality as needed. Any other questions?
Cool. Yeah, first off, just want to say it's an awesome idea. Like you're taking semantic HTML to like a totally next level there.
Cheers.
Embedding in an API. Just a couple of questions about the roadmap for the future. Because to me, this looks awesome for a new project. I was just starting off fresh. This is definitely what I do. But for most professionals, that's not the case. We're maintaining existing software. We're maintaining existing WordPress stuff, for example.
Yeah.
And to me, web components, their greatest feature is that I can take existing functionality and encapsulate it slowly, piece by piece, into new web components and slowly migrate across an existing application, piece by piece, into like a new API or something like that. So if I did have an existing WordPress application that I wanted to slowly move across into using the WordPress API instead of the PHP renderer, if I wanted to use this, what sort of roadmap moving forward do you guys plan with your web components here?
Yeah, so I think the biggest problem for us in terms of making it easy for people to transfer over, in terms of the actual markup, I mean, depending on the setup on the back end, it's really easy, right? So like, for example, we did a demo last week where we took a Guardian page and we just saved did a HTML dump, and then I literally did a find and replace on like text nodes and images to replace them out with our versions, and that works really well. But the problem is migrating data in a big chunk.
Yeah, I guess what I was getting at here is like you're in a situation where you can't migrate data. You've got like an existing API that you can't change. Too much relies on it that you need to still move forward.
So I would say in the future what we would look at, and this probably isn't something that we personally would focus on, though I'm not sure, this comes back to sort of looking at alternatives to our API, is making an adapter for these elements to talk to the WordPress API directly. And you can do that I'd probably say you'd add an endpoint onto the WordPress API, which has the same interface as what this talks to. Or, as Corey said, you could make a JavaScript that intercepts the requests and transforms it and sends them over to the WordPress install instead. So that's what we do in future, and definitely encourage a community one. I'm not sure how big a priority that would be for us internally, because I think that's something we also want to focus on new projects and new sites. I think that's where the real benefit comes out of. But yeah, I really like that idea.
Cool.
Cool.
What sort of pricing model are you looking at?
So at the moment it's all live and in production. It's a freemium model. So there's a free small tier. It's mostly from a development sort of thing, and then it goes to $30 for like small to medium projects, and then $100. So it's very simple, like 3-tier thing. It's based on API requests. So an API request being like when this Simpla text loads onto the page, it will make an API request. So if you've got like 50 text elements on the page, then that will mean 50 when that page loads. So that is per project. So like if you've got one project, you'll set up a plan for that, and then you make another project, you make another plan. Having said that, we are doing price testing at the moment, and that might change. So we'd love to get your feedback on, like, you know, if you're interested, like what kind of pricing schemes would work. Yeah.
What's your relationship like with Polymer? Because over the last year and a half, it was pretty sketchy. With broken backwards compatibility, like 0.5, 0.6, or then jumping back to 1.0.
Yeah. So, sorry. Polymer, yeah, it's had a bit of an interesting sort of last, like, yeah, when did they go stable? Like a year ago, year and a half ago or something. And we jumped on, we jumped on when they said, all right, we're going to, we've gone to 0.6, 0.8, and we are getting to 1, and then we're stabilizing, and we're just going to be a framework around it. And then since then, we've been in close contact with the product manager at Google. He gave us a really great testimonial actually, and we're in contact with him a lot. They've worked really well for us, and their version 2 is going to bring it closer to the spec as well. And it is stabilizing out. I think you've got to be conscious when you're working with those frameworks that are changing a fair bit. But since version 1, they've been very, very stable, and version 2 is going to be, I think, yeah, very similar, stable, I think.
So you're happy with that and gonna continue?
Say again?
You're happy with it and gonna continue using it?
Yeah, definitely. I think the big thing for us is development time on those elements is really great. Also, the community around it is fantastic. You can't beat that. And also, they give you a lot of extra benefits that are really helpful, like CSS variables, shady DOM polyfill, which is a semi-shadow DOM polyfill, which really helps. I won't go into that, that's a whole other thing, but look that up. That's really helpful. Cool. Anything else?
That's cool. Okay, that's it.
One real quick one, which is,
You don't do quick, man.
so we'll actually be quick. But non-Chrome browsers, do you use DOM content modifier?
DOM content modifiers.
What are your listeners for the DOM content being modified?
So everything's done through, so the web components polyfill handles everything. So yeah, so Polymer, to get Polymer to work on non-Chrome browsers, you need to use the web components polyfill library, which is actually very thin. The heavy part of the web components polyfill is the shadow DOM polyfill, which, as I said, you don't need to use, and Polymer, you can use the shady DOM, which does a very large portion of what shadow DOM achieves.
Oh, it's just because you said something about like you have some performance things you're looking at.
Yeah, look, it's just there, as you can see, there's a slight performance difference between the two browsers, and I think that's mostly just from, I mean, polyfills are going to add overhead regardless, and we're doing like a lot of stuff, so that adds up. So we just need to work on trimming all that back as much as we can.
Okay.
Also, Shadow DOM, if anyone's interested, that one is like the first thing the browsers are implementing, and like the next version of most of the major browsers are going to be implementing that. Cool.
Thanks very much.